Gaza. We can speak now to Hanan Ashrawi, who is a Palestinian leader, an activist and a former member of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the Executive Committee. She joins us from Ramallah. I've been just looking at your Twitter page. You have been tweeting about the situation in Gaza. What is your understanding of the humanitarian situation there today?
Well, it's not just a humanitarian situation. You have here an unbridled use of violence by the strongest army in the region, targeting innocent civilians, targeting residential buildings in an area that has been totally closed in, besieged, without any means of defense, with no air force, with no shelters, with no sirens, and at the same time the Israelis claim self-defense. It's not just humanitarian, it's a question, it's an existential issue. It's political, it's legal, yes, it is human, and it is not certainly military, because Israel's use of the military is punitive, is immoral, and in many ways it is an expression of an unbridled occupation that has existed with impunity for all these years, that has never been held accountable since it was created 73 years ago, since the other occupation 54 years ago. Israel has acted with full impunity and has targeted the Palestinians as a captive population under its control and outside the law. So we look at this as a rogue state that is... Yes,
Hanan Ashrawi, 36 hours ago, the focus was on East Jerusalem and the plight of the people being forced from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah. Hamas then fired rockets into Israel. Now we're where we are today, 44 Palestinians that we know of that are dead, and of course a number of Israelis as well. Do you agree with how Hamas has handled things?
The question is not just Hamas, but all the Palestinians have been telling Israel that this escalation in Jerusalem, this continuous targeting of Jerusalem, to carry out ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem, to kick Palestinians out of their homes and neighborhoods, to transform the character, history, culture of Jerusalem into an exclusively Jewish city, which it's not. All these things have really led to an escalation whereby Netanyahu cynically exploited the reality on the ground and escalated in order to stay out of prison, as we know, for corruption indictments. Anyway, but this is not new. This escalation is new. It has been emboldened, of course, by the Trump administration's collusion. It has been emboldened by the Biden administration's lack of action and the reticence of the Europeans, and it's been ongoing. So now the question was, do you allow Israel to target Jerusalem, to kick out Palestinians, to target the holiest Islamic site here in the middle of Ramadan, and to get away with it? Now, they were warned, Hamas warned them, everybody else warned them. You are crossing not just red lines, you are provoking. You are provoking the Palestinians beyond endurance. You are provoking Arabs and Muslims and Christians everywhere. Just stop it. Not only didn't they stop, they escalated. So now you have a response. Everybody deals with a response. Let's deal with the causes.
Hanan, sorry to interrupt you, Hanan. I'm afraid we don't have very much time. I want to ask you, you were in a position of power to do something. You were a member of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. You left that organization. Why did you leave that organization?
For many reasons. This is a domestic issue. I left because I felt that the PLO was being sidelined, was becoming more and more enfeebled. That the older generation is staying, the younger ones are not able to participate in decision-making, and there's an erosion of rights and freedoms and so on. It's not the time to discuss all this. But I think what's happening is a new, not just balance of power, new realities on the ground, that the Palestinians feel empowered as a people, in a popular movement, in a revolution, if you want, to tell the Israelis enough is enough. You cannot hold the whole nation captive, and you cannot inflict immeasurable pain on them and get away with it.
Yes, but can I ask you, who is leading the Palestinians? Is it Hamas with what they're doing right now in terms of their violence? Because they will never win with the violence, will they? Because in terms of fighting with Israel, they will always be outnumbered.
It's on the ground, of course, the people took the initiative and Hamas responded to the people's demands. But in terms of what's happening now, as I said, it's a popular movement. Nobody takes decisions and says, now do this or now do that. People were protecting their lives, their homes, their city, Jerusalem, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. People were protecting their right to live in peace and dignity and freedom on their own land without constantly being attacked by Israel and dehumanized by the world. So if you want to talk about leadership, I think there's leadership on the ground, the people, military leadership, probably Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other factions. But in terms of political decision-making, there's a glaring vacuum.
So what happens now? Hamas says it's going to continue what it's doing. Israel says it's going to continue with its violence. Where does this end? More deaths?
I think, unfortunately, it's the Palestinian people who always pay the price. It's the innocents who pay the price. 49 innocent Palestinians in Gaza were killed, 14 of them children, 3 women. And of course, in the West Bank, you have 2 people killed, 1 teenager. You have 400 people wounded, injured. The whole situation now is inflamed. Palestinians in 48 Palestine, Palestinians in the West Bank and Jerusalem, and Palestinians in Gaza. So now, as a one movement now, I think we need to see that the world looks at Palestine and the Palestinian people as equals, as people with rights, as people who deserve to live and not to constantly be targeted and dehumanized by the Israelis. And this is very important. Either the international community understands that there is never going to be any peace or security or stability for Israel as an occupying power and for the region as a whole unless you deal with the causes. Stop Israel's impunity and aggression and oppression of the Palestinian people and the occupation, and the Palestinians have to have their rights in accordance with international law and international humanitarian law. This is the only way. Otherwise, this will go on one generation after the other. There is no normal occupation. There is no normal injustice. There is no normal oppression. So let's denormalize this situation. And if you want a normal and calm situation, then impose international law, have a system of accountability for Israel and sanctions, and provide the Palestinian people with protection, and preferably the protection of the law.
And I'm just hearing from my producer that 48 people have now died, Palestinians have now died as a result of what's been going on. So just to give you that latest figure, you talk about the international community. We have a new president in the US who says that human rights is at the forefront of his administration. How much pressure is there on the United States, on President Biden, to do something about the situation in Israel and the West Bank?
Well, certainly there's no pressure from Congress that has done exactly what AIPAC tells them to do, with a few exceptions. I don't want to generalize. There's no pressure from the public, except now we have an active solidarity movement, a network in the U.S., particularly among minorities, among Black Lives Matter, indigenous people, and so on. There is, and women's groups and so on, there is real solidarity, and people are beginning to see what's happening. It's no longer the Israeli version that is prevalent, that has distorted people's view of what's happening. This is coming out. Trevor Noah also came out and said, so people are beginning to understand that this is an occupation on the rampage, and that if you are committed to human rights, then you have to respect the rights of the Palestinians, and you have to curb Israeli violations and hold it accountable. You have to stop funding and supporting the Israeli military and the Israeli occupation and the Israeli aggression on captive Palestinians. This is not going to lead anywhere unless the American administration and Biden understands that sitting back and saying I have other priorities is only going to make the situation escalate. And unless the American people act, and we have seen demonstrations everywhere, in New York, in Washington, in Chicago, and in Europe, and so on, and of course everywhere in Palestine, people are moving and saying, you cannot drop this. You cannot treat Israel with kid gloves and give it preferential treatment with a sense of entitlement that it's untouchable. No, Israel has to be held to account and Israel has to stop. That's the only way you can have real peace.
Many thanks for speaking to us on Al Jazeera. Hanan Ashrawi, Palestinian leader and activist and a former member of the PLO.
Thank you.